The meaning of life. What is life all about, if anything? Perhaps this is the most important question of all, or at least relevant, existentially relevant for everyone. How one answers this question is intricately linked to how one understands the nature of the world, what one understands fundamental reality to be. The topic of this introductory video series is the question, what is the nature of reality? Not merely subjective reality, your reality, my reality, but the nature of reality as a whole. This question provides key perspectives and implications of deep existential importance. What is this life, this existence we find ourselves in, and what constitutes it at its deepest level? The British author Douglas Adams titled one of his books, Life, the Universe and Everything. It's meant to be funny, of course, but that's a lot to cover in one book. But it wouldn't be completely inappropriate to characterize the overall perspective of this video series in much the same way. The question, what is the nature of reality, isn't just an academic or theoretical question. How we understand and interpret this question has, I believe, existential significance for each of us. It can affect the quality of our lives as we live them. So it's quite important. There are three main questions that will be addressed. The question of whether or not we have free will, or if our actions are predetermined. That's pretty important when it comes to personal responsibility, ethical obligations, and even overall happiness and satisfaction with life. Then there's the question of life after death. Usually this question is associated with religious belief, but the perspective taken in this video series will not be religious. Instead, it will be entirely secular, philosophical, and scientific. One of the aims of this series is to suggest that it turns out that even with a secular approach, the question of life after death, of continuation of conscious experience after physical death, is a real question, an interesting and open question. And finally, the question of the meaning of life, no less. That'll be the third topic. So these are some pretty big questions, and because these episodes are fairly short, the questions obviously can't be treated in full detail, but I'll attempt to present some of the main insights, some of the main points. Later videos will do more in-depth discussions of these and related questions, both at an introductory and a more academically oriented or advanced level. Brief introduction. My name is Nikolaj Petersen. I hold a PhD in philosophy, so I practice philosophy at an academic level, but I also seek to present philosophy and some of its main points or insights in a more accessible way. I've written a few books and I'm creating videos like this one. In the hope that a broader audience might find it interesting or useful. I'm also a teacher and have been for quite a number of years. I teach philosophy, of course, but also history and math. Okay, so what is reality at its fundamental level? What is existence, this condition we find ourselves in? Well, that's a metaphysical question. Metaphysics is the branch of philosophy that deals with the most fundamental structures of reality. The most widespread conception of reality in the Western world, the early 21st century at least, is the doctrine of Physicalism. This is the idea that the only thing that exists independently is the physical, and everything is reducible to it. Physicalism says that the physical, matter in a loose sense, is the fundamental substance of our reality. Specifically, this would dictate that consciousness can't exist without the physical, without the brain. In this doctrine, our consciousness is usually seen as somehow being just a product of physical neural processes within the brain. This position, physicalism, is widespread and for good reason. The natural sciences have been immensely successful in explaining how the physical world operates. The roots of physicalism reach all the way back to the Enlightenment, the birth of empirical and scientific thinking, learning about the world through observation and testing of hypotheses. But now this kind of thinking dominates Western culture and philosophy. Traditional religious or mythological understandings have been overwhelmingly replaced by facts and scientific explanations, often very precise and exact scientific explanations. So, for historical reasons and due to its sheer explanatory and argumentative power, the idea of physicalism being closely connected with the natural sciences has become the common modern understanding of reality. And tied to this idea is often the notion that other views on reality are somewhat naive. Often it seems people don't concern themselves with any other perspectives and simply assume that we have all the knowledge we need to understand what reality fundamentally is, and any remaining questions are for quantum physics, perhaps, to figure out. However, this position faces several significant problems. First, the doctrine of physicalism is not in itself a scientific finding. Natural sciences examine how nature operates. They observe and look at the physical world, but neither the doctrine of physicalism nor the practice of science has shown or can show that there are no non-physical aspects of reality. Consider the following if it's helpful. Learning what biology has to tell us about the world does not exhaust what chemistry can tell us. Chemistry does not exhaust physics. Similarly, we cannot be certain that physics exhausts metaphysics. In other words, there are non-physical phenomena. It's possible that they are not ultimately explicable in physical terms. Empirical, scientific investigation is a staggeringly impressive tool, but it simply cannot operate beyond the physical. That is to say, it's not a scientific finding that physicalism is true. It must be viewed as a presumption or a hypothesis. The second related problem with the doctrine of physicalism is the problem of consciousness. How does consciousness arise from the brain? Consciousness is something non-physical. Thoughts and ideas. Those aren't physical, they are intangible, meaning that they can't be measured, for example. How much does a thought weigh? How many meters is an idea? They simply aren't empirically accessible. But how do physical processes generate something non-physical? There are no good theories to account for this. So the problem of consciousness is indeed a big issue for this doctrine. We might also note that the problem of consciousness gives rise to some secondary problems for the doctrine of physicalism as well. The problem of free will, for example. If our thoughts and will are simply just products of physical neural processes in the brain, and what happens in the brain is governed and determined by the laws of nature, then this means that our thoughts and will are determined by those laws as well. So we don't have a free will. Our actions are predetermined, not by some God, but by the causal mechanisms of the physical, or the laws of nature. It's not impossible that this could be the case. Most people find this concept discomforting, don't really like the idea that they couldn't have done something different from what they actually did. That our future actions are locked, and that we don't really have any real free will, only some kind of illusion or free will or choices generated by our brain's physical mechanisms. Another problem is how to ground ethics objectively. Usually we see some actions as good and some actions as bad or even evil. We view some actions as ethically superior to others. It's better to be kind and helpful and patient than it is to hurt people for no reason. But in a physicalistic context, it's very hard to explain why some actions should be ethically superior to others. The laws of nature, well, they're just there. They aren't good or evil in any moral sense. And even if everything is determined by the laws of nature, then nothing has any real ethical value. So usually physicalism leads to ethical relativism, cultural relativism, for example, which holds that some cultures have different ethical norms than others, but none of them are objectively better than any other. So we as humans have intuitions about morality and ethics, but if one subscribes to a physicalist point of view, then it becomes really hard to ground it in anything substantial. All in all, there are good reasons for taking a closer look at alternatives to the doctrine of physicalism. Indeed, in the last couple of decades, non-physicalist approaches to reality have been explored to a greater degree than was the case during the 20th century. Should it be the case that physicalism is not true, or at least not as true as is often presumed, it would open up entirely new perspectives on some of the questions I mentioned. The question of free will, that a continued existence or life after physical death, or even the meaning of life. And then it suddenly becomes a very existentially relevant question, whether or not physicalism is true. The question of the nature of reality, at least if one wants to live an intellectually or existentially reflective life, so to speak. Those were some introductory remarks for this video series, outlining some of the rationale for why it's important to take the nature of reality question seriously. In episode 3, we'll treat the question of continued existence after physical death. In episode 4, the meaning of life. And the topic of the next episode, part 2 in the series, will be the question of free will. Thanks.